Today, I'm joined by Paul Lambert, author of There's No Such Thing as a Palestinian. And of course, our regular guest, Salim Mansur. And Salim, I think this is probably the 97th or 98th time you've been on a Just Right Media production. Hello, Salim.
Good morning. Hello. Hello, Paul. Pleasure to meet you.
Morning.
Now, Paul is actually joining us from Berlin in Germany, and Salim is in London, and I'm just slightly outside of London at some undisclosed location. So I read this book, Paul, and I personally found it. I'm not a person who is an historian or have the same interest that you do, I guess, in the Arab-Israeli conflict. But I found it interesting in that you bring up a number of points that I never thought of, never even knew. For example, the etymology of the word Palestine and Palestinian, things of that nature. And your conclusions are rather, shall I say, provocative. But why don't you tell us, first of all, what is your interest in the Arab-Israeli world and that particular conflict there? I know that you're not an Israeli Jew, you're not a Muslim Arab. What's your background that would make you interested in this conflict?
Well, actually, I got involved, took an interest in this particular conflict rather by accident. It was many years ago when I first thought of writing a book like this, and at the time I was living in Gothenburg, Sweden, and I was in my early 20s, and of course this story is in the news all the time, and it especially back then there was this more than usual amount of terrorism, and before they had the wall. And I told myself, this is an issue I never want to get involved in. I never want to have a passionate opinion about. I'm tired of hearing about it. But even one day there was an Arab demonstration in Gothenburg, and there's an Arab calling himself Palestinian handing out some handbills, very anti-Israel, anti-Semitic. And then I gave him a rather dirty look, said, I don't want anything to do with this. And he pushed me down in the street, right in front of the police. The police didn't do anything. He said, you watch yourself, you dirty Jew. Now, instead of overreacting, I decided I'm going to find out what this is actually all about. What is this fight all about? That's when I went to the libraries. That's when I went to the old newspapers. Now, I didn't have the same view. Now, I don't know what the view is nowadays in North America, but I think it was, certainly in Europe, it was this idea that there was once this ancient nation called Palestine, a people of Palestinians who had been living thousands of years in a region that's called Palestine, perfectly peaceful, not bothering anyone, until suddenly, after the Second World War, a bunch of Jews came in and chased them all off, and that's the source of the conflict. Now, having had a long understanding of the Bible and of the Christian faith, I knew that wasn't exactly true. We certainly heard the name Israel, we certainly heard the name Judea, that coming from the past. But that was the main wisdom, and I'm afraid it still is the popular wisdom, that there is a Palestinian people who is the indigenous inhabitants of this land, and that the Jews are relative latecomers and had taken the land unjustly through different means and with the help of other foreign players, United Nations, United States. And so my interest was in finding out what the real truth is, and then coming out and presenting that truth for a better understanding and for people better to consider this issue.
Okay, now you actually tried to enlist in the Israeli armed forces, did you not?
I did. Shortly after. It wasn't immediately after 9/11, but shortly after that, there was a new spate of terror bombings in Israel every other day, but a dozen people getting blown up on buses or in pizza restaurants. And a young, hot-headed 25-year-old I was. I had I wasn't married. I had nothing else to do. I did try and I did contact the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force. Now, on a technicality, I couldn't join because I wasn't an Israeli citizen, and of course it's restricted to them. They offered me other ways I could volunteer. It really wasn't practical. But I did take an interest in that. It was as a young man, you felt you had to do something. I felt like I was one of the few men who actually had learned about what's really going on if nobody else knew what was going on. You just felt you had to do something.
Out of a sense of injustice, I guess.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
Now, could you let's get into the book. Could you just give us a brief overview of your book? It's a rather provocative title that a lot will disagree with, but there's no such thing as a Palestinian. What's it all about, Paul?
Well, it's about that these, without going to the conclusion right away, it is as clear as the title says, that these people calling themselves Palestinians, they're not indigenous to the region we know as Palestine. They have no history in Palestine. They've built nothing of note in Palestine. So they are actually latecomers. Those people known as Palestinians today, they are descendants of people who came as a result of the Zionist enterprise. Typically, the early Zionists and maybe people who hired cheap foreign labor might learn a lesson from this, but they enlisted Arab labor to come from elsewhere in the Arab world. Those people and their descendants became what are known as Palestinians, largely. And then there was a later influx of people claiming refugee status. But at any rate, that the world believes that these is an ancient people who've always been in that land. In fact, they're very, very recent newcomers, historically speaking. In fact, you won't find a single reference to a Palestinian people written prior to 1967, referring to this group of resident Arabs.
You mean just the Arabs, of course, because Palestine has existed for, well, a few thousand years, and all of the people of that particular region, including what is now called Israel, was called Palestine, or Philistine, probably before that. But an interesting polemic. Let's get into it. Salim, your first thoughts on reading Paul's book?
Well, my first thought is, who did Paul write this book about? I mean, it is his book, but I mean, one writes a book or one writes a paper, an essay, makes a movie, whatever it is, there is an audience. Otherwise, it remains all within oneself, you know. I have a zillion books in my head. I haven't written them, so I can say, you know, I'm an author of a zillion books. But the books that I've written are with a purpose, to set some records straight, to get a certain view out there that is backed up independently and objectively and can be tested and argued over. And that is a contribution being made. So my first thought was, as I picked up Paul's book, apart from the title itself, which is, to say the least, provocative, I suppose there is that element of being provocative in the way Paul set up the title. You know, he can, I'm sure, Paul, you're going to correct me on that, or you're going to give me your thoughts on that matter. But the title itself, then, if anybody picks up the book and then goes beyond the title and into the reading of it, the immediate thought emerges, who is this book being addressed to?
So why don't you answer the question, Paul? Who are you addressing the book to?
Well, you have to know, when I wrote this book, it's a rather short book. The idea is it's a primer for people who really know nothing about this topic to start with. And when this was first written, it was written with a certain sense of urgency, I have to admit. When I first conceived this book, this was early in the 2000s, 2003, 2004, with the great degree of terrorism. And the people I sat with in Sweden at the pub watching the news on the telly, they all saw the same terror with the same horror and disgust I had, but then they'd always say, well, you know, they should create a state for them so this would stop. It's like, oh, this is terrible, but I don't blame them because they had their land stolen. And so it's really just to get people to thinking. And, you know, you say it's a provocative title, but it's right to the point. It really would shock, it really upset the preconceived notions of so many people. Now, they think they understand the conflict through the eyes of an oppressed people having had their land stolen. And so this was immediately a primer for those who believe that, to at least begin to have a second look at this and just crack open a little bit of the history, a little bit of the current affairs. And then if it really motivates them, they can learn more and from some more formal sources.
I see.
That's the point. The issue you're saying, crack crack open the history, and you are situating yourself in the context of the immediate post 9/11 world, both out here in North America and in the Middle East, in Israel. Before I proceed, I imagine you are familiar with Israel. You've been to Israel. Is that correct? I mean, you've traveled within Israel.
I've not been to Israel itself. No, I've certainly been in contact with many people have been in who are in Israel, but I've not personally been there. Not yet.
Oh, I was making the assumption that you have been to Israel. And had some so everything. Then I mean, good that I posed this question. Not that I had thought about posing it, but just in the matter of this back and forth, that clarifies the whole issue. Your writing your book, this small monograph or a long essay, is as an independent individual, let's say a world citizen, or you're a Canadian living in Europe. In that sense, you are a world citizen, and the subject matter of the book has got a global interest behind it. You know, it is an issue that is talked about, written about, and has been on the political arena for almost a century now. Not almost, more than a century now, if we choose the dates. And choosing the dates is also, there's an element of being arbitrary, but it has to be objectively meet certain criteria. So I'm choosing the date 1917 November, that's the Balfour Declaration, and 2017, the election of President Trump, because with President Trump, in a sense, we can argue now, looking forward, provided he's re-elected again, which I believe he will be, but that's another subject. We have entered a new phase. So there are different phases in this long, drawn-out 100-year conflict, 1917 to 2017. And so this issue has been in global headline news and so on and so forth. And so your writing, in this sense, is a response to that concern or interest of people around the world on a topic that is heavily, heavily contested. Am I right to say that? I believe that's it is. You know, I'm not an Arab. I am of Muslim origin, though I have Arab relatives. You know, my better half is an Arab from North Africa. I have, of course, traveled extensively in the Middle East. I've been to Israel many times, and I have sat and been engaged with my what I call my Jewish brothers and sisters. You know, I have prayed with them at the Western Wall. I've been in the synagogues. I've been to, you know, prayed with my Jewish friends, and then with my Arab friends at the tomb of the patriarch, that is Abraham, in Hebron. So in that sense, on a personal level, that is your personal level and my personal level, I think we will have differences of perspective at the minimum, you know, because I have been engaged with that part of the world in a personal sense.
Of course, if I could just jump in here, of course, that a person doesn't have to be an Israeli to comment on Israeli politics. Just like you and I, Salim, are Canadians, but we spend an inordinate amount of time talking about American politics.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that was not the intent of my observation. It was just to establish. I mean, one can talk about the moon without having been a Neil Armstrong, you know, but talking about the moon from a perspective of Neil Armstrong would be different than the people gazing upon the moon. So that's it, you know. A lot of people have written about the Middle East, and a lot of people have written about the Arab-Israeli conflict, Palestinian-Israeli conflict, however one describes it. And then some of the great pieces of work, literature, have been written by non-Arabs in that sense, whether they're Americans or Europeans, but who traveled to that part of the world. I mean, in my mind, one of the most famous books that jump up as I engage with Paul is Mark Twain's writing, The Innocents Abroad, if any of you know that book, Mark Twain, of course, all of us know, the great American writer from the 19th century, mid-19th century. And Mark Twain traveled to that part of the world, and he moved around in Palestine, as it was designated Palestine, in the years immediately after the American Civil War. I mean, if my dates are correct, he went to Palestine in 1867. And so, one can, as a historian, one can go back and collect these material to see what other people saw. And so that's what I was asking, whether, Paul, you have sat in a market in Jerusalem and engage with the people and see what they have to say and how they're reacting or
I'll
reacting.
say that. No,
Yeah.
I'll say I don't deny at all it would have been a greater advantage before or during the time I wrote this book if I could have been in Israel or other Middle Eastern countries to meet and gain the experiences of others. But remember, keep in mind again who this was written for. These are other people who had not been to Israel. They are simply testing, they're simply learning what they're told in the media, uncritically, accepting it as a matter of truth. So in that sense, and for the purpose why this book was written, it wasn't so necessary for me to go and confirm it on the ground firsthand with people in Israel, Arab and Jewish alike. It was simply to be able to find the logical inconsistencies and some recorded history, and let's start with that. And I think it's very interesting you brought up Mark Twain in Jerusalem in 1967, because he describes what is outside the walls of Jerusalem being absolutely nothing, a few donkey tracks and just desolate land. And this is supposedly the land that has thousands of years been some kind of Palestinian civilization. Well, Mark Twain's very writings belie that. So yes, thank you for bringing that up. That's something that's
but that's it. I mean, Mark Twain's book is not simply a name that I threw out in the midst of this conversation. Though Mark Twain traveled to Palestine in 1867 and wrote the book Innocents Abroad, that book has been subject to a lot of analysis. It's apart from the author, who one of the more famous American writers. I read that book in my early 20s, and I just loved it not because of the history of what Mark Twain was writing about, but the language. I mean, anyone who wants to learn and develop the skill of writing, and especially when, in my case, English is not my mother tongue. I was absolutely taken up by Mark Twain's book because of the brilliance of his writing. I've read his other books, but they were fiction, Huckleberry Finn and, Tom Sawyer. So the book, what Mark Twain wrote, was written now. I think there's a complete consensus, I would say a large consensus among historians and writers and knowledgeable people. I mean, not people just, sitting outside and writing, but people with great depth of understanding, knowledge. Britishers who came and ruled that part of the world after World War I, who have written about it. Of course, T. Lawrence's book, Seven Pillars of Wisdom, is one of the great classics of that period. That Mark Twain was engaged in writing a satirical, ironical book. I mean, much of what Mark Twain wrote in his description cannot be sustained, but he was writing that book, and because who Mark Twain was, like who Shakespeare is, a lot of people think that Shakespeare wrote Roman history because he wrote Julius Caesar or Antony and Cleopatra. That's not. You cannot take the history of Rome out of Julius Caesar or out of Shakespeare, and similarly, one cannot understand Middle East and Palestine out of Mark Twain. It's just one impressionistic writing of a man who was basically a humorist and a satirist, And he was writing that satire because what he was writing about, I mean, he goes into Jerusalem, he goes into the Church of the Holy, and he's making fun of it because basically he's telling this is what we worship. We meaning in this case the Christian world. And he was introducing to the Christian world, particularly Americans, who were totally unaware of the world beyond their own continent, beyond their own states, you know, so he was making fun of. And that was the first trip, by the way, which has now become so common that, you know, we have Mark Steins and all the others going out, you know, on cruise ships, you know, and the tickets are sold, you know, come in and spend 2 weeks with authors and poets and so on and so forth, you know. That's the way the marketing takes place. Well, this was the marketing. I mean, the American press that hired Mark Twain to go on this cruise did it with a very great purpose, that they're going to sell the cruise subsequently through the writing of Mark Twain to other Americans, you know. So there it was. He was creating controversy. He was creating a sort of a description which was part fiction, part humor, part irony, part satire. So, yeah. I mean, aside from that, I'm not going to get into.
Yeah, let's move aside from Mark Twain and talk about P.L. Edwardsson, who's your nom de plume, by the way, Paul. You've written your book under the nom de plume P.L. Edwardsson. I'm just used to calling you Paul. But P.L. Edwardsson.
What Paul said, and that's what I want to come back to. Sorry to interrupt you, Robert, before I lose my thought. Paul said, when I asked what is the target audience and so on, and Paul, you said, if I'm correctly remember now, you were indicating that you wrote this book as a sort of a primer to people who have never been to that part of the world, but because of the issues are in the news, so it is a primer that you write. So I take it that it is a primer that you're writing, and that leaves me asking the subsequent question. If it was a primer, if it is a serious primer, I don't find any indication in the book, however small it is, of a bibliographical reading list of major writings on this subject matter. I don't find any citation in the body of the book of major authors and thinkers and writers and documentation, whether the documents are from the UN sources or whether the documents are from the sources of the governments that have been involved in that part of the world. For instance, the British ruled that place after Jerusalem was taken in 1917. Ruled that place until 1948, and there is a heavy documentation of it. You know, my personal library is filled with that. There is the documentation from the Ottoman period. You know, Ottomans ruled that place for over 700 years, and so on and so forth. So that leaves me with the thing that it is very much a subjective view, which you have the right to express, your subjective view, but it cannot stand to an objective inquiry. And that's what my take is of your book.
Well, why don't you tell us about
sorry.
Go ahead, Paul.
No, I want to respond to that. That criticism, as far as it goes, is fair. Certainly, I've heard that criticism from others who have reviewed the book as well. My only answer to that is, again, remembering both the audience and the urgency it was from. The common man on the street watching the news accepts so many falsehoods, both about the history and the current events involved. And they're not waiting for citations. They're not waiting for bibliographies. In my attempt to keep this a compact document, I didn't fill it with that. Now, if I were to do a second edition, I might include a page of a bibliography at the back or something just to give it a little more objectivity, as you're suggesting, Salim. Certainly a second edition would be very much reworked. But again, the challenge then would be, I'd also have a little more biography, a little more about the actual men responsible and involved on both sides of the conflict. The challenge then would to keep this to be a compact primer, and perhaps with a little better information so those who are interested could read on in other sources.
What is your major argument, Paul? What is your major argument here for the title of the book? For example, there is no such thing as a Palestinian. Can you give us, maybe in point form, why we shouldn't be calling the people in Gaza and the West Bank Palestinians?
Simply because they are a people who really have no long history in this land, any more than newcomers to Syrian refugees in Germany. We didn't call them ancient Germans or the ancient Teutons, or refugees now in Sweden. You wouldn't call them the ancient Swedes or ancient Scandinavians. It's been completely twisted. We know who these people are. We can document where and when they come from, but most importantly, we know exactly when the early Zionist movement came to rebuild the land, and they purchased the land perfectly legally from absentee landlords, and this is all well documented. And why we should say there's no such thing as a Palestinian. The very word erases the Jewish history from the land. You understand what I'm saying? It's just like, oh, it's just a name. Even some pro-Israeli commentators, men like Dennis Prager, saying, well, I'd still call them Palestinians. They're a new nation. We recognize that. That's fine. But it's still diverting people away from the truth. It's just simply not true. What was the name of the old ancient king?
It could be some degree of credulity could be given to you if you had put within brackets the time period that you are discussing, whether it is from 1917 or from 1948, etc. But a blanket statement like that has no credibility. I mean, the argument you have just now made has no credibility.
Salim, if I could just jump in here.
Just a moment, because
but he addressed what you're
contested right through history. I mean, going to period before the Roman times, going before the Roman times into the biblical time, this part of the world has been part of the traffic in the movement of people.
But if I could interject, Salim, he does address what you're talking about, because he says right at the very beginning of the book that this book is post 1948-49. He's not talking about the ancient history of the land, but how we deal with it today in a socio-political argument.
Yeah.
Well, that too raises.
I'm not contesting there's a land called Palestine. No, I'm not contesting there's a land called Palestine. What I contest is these people popularly known as Palestinian in popular parlance. That's where the lie is. Now, we talked about since 1917 to 2017 being a coming of age. Well, half that time, 1917 to 1967, sure there was a conflict. Nobody was talking about any Palestinians. Between 1948 and 1967, the Arab countries coalesced to come destroy Israel and finish Hitler's work. There was no battle cry, freedom for Palestinians or statehood for Palestinians. No, it was push the Jews into the sea. There was nothing. And to this land, it means nothing. During the Jordanian occupation of what Judea and Samaria, many call West Bank, there were fewer than 1 million Arabs there. They did nothing to improve the land because the land meant nothing to these people. It's just all of a sudden when it's important to the Jews and the Jews finally come and reclaim their ancient land, all of a sudden here comes this new Palestinian people. And they also played upon a certain moral weakness in the West, where we have this idea we want to side with the underdog all the time. So while the Arabs had the pride of place, Arab-Israeli conflict, the Arabs were always Goliath and Israelis were David, and so we sided with them. So they were smart enough to say, well, let's reformulate it to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. All of a sudden, out of nowhere, here comes this new Palestinian nation who's been oppressed and is small and is weak and has a lower hand. And now Western sympathies, ones who aren't familiar with the history, have been given to these Palestinians. And again, you always have to remember the context. Yes, there's no such thing as a Palestinian. Yes, if this were an academic writing, it would have no credibility. It's a popular writing to address, in an urgent sense, people who have completely the wrong idea about this conflict.
Okay,
and
so
in that case, the title is very apt.
So if your argument, I can get into everything you have said and put it not only in context but slice through it. So leaving that slicing aside, your own premise that you were seeking to provide a primer to outside people with some understanding of what this issue is all about. And so in that sense, it is your view, your polemical view, your subjective view, which is all fine. And that has clarified. So a reader picking it up and reading it will know this is Paul Lambert's view, and Paul Lambert's view is just one more view. But to stretch your own point of view into something more credible and therefore legitimate and objective that would have people outside other than you reading it, you and your friend, that there is some credible argument and it's not simply a polemic, then wouldn't it be proper to cite that Israelis themselves, if I take your argument, Israelis are the original Palestinians. Once the Roman war was over and Rome had taken over the province and named it Palestine and exiled the Jews from Palestine. And the Jews were scattered around over the world at the beginning of the Jewish diaspora. But going back to your original point, Palestine, the Palestinians are the Jews. They're the original Palestinians. Well, the Jews themselves recognize the nomenclature, that is the nominal name about Palestinians as Arabs and Christians. It is not somebody sitting like you or me or Robert from outside saying if there is Palestinians and no Palestinians. The Jews themselves recognize it. And the list of writing is so vast that I don't want to overwhelm you with it. But immediately the name comes up of Maxim Rodinson, one of the great Jewish scholars of Europe, a French Jew, writing in the period during the 1967 war. And his book, which became in a sense an iconic book, is called Israel, a Colonial Settler State. The fact that you're saying that there is no historical record about Palestinians other than the Jews is not an argument. There is record, but it is not an argument. I mean, what sort of record you're looking for will differ from place to place, culture to culture, and civilization to civilization. I would point out, again, without going again too much into the depth of history, for instance, after the Roman conquest, the pagans and Gentiles became Christian. There was no Arabs there because Arab is the very precise term Arab is only limited to the people of the Arabian Peninsula, in the heartland, in the depth. They were not there. Egypt has a 7,000-year-old civilization. What is today Iraq or what is today Syria and Lebanon, they have, a several millennium-old civilization. After all, the Babylonian exile of Jews in 5th century BC, 500 BC, was in Babylonia, which is in modern-day Iraq. So the argument that there is nothing, it doesn't hold any water. So coming back to it, when the Arab armies from inside the deep Arab desert, they're the only Arabs, there is no other Arabs, that came out and then conquered Jerusalem in 638, which opened the door for Jews to come back to Jerusalem in 638. And with the Arab armies, there were Arab Jews, that is the Jews who were had been settled inside the depth hinterland of what is today Saudi Arabia. They came in. From that moment onwards, ironically, this was Christian. Palestine was Christian. Jerusalem was a Christian city. The temple, that is the church, Holy Sepulchre, was built in the 4th century by the mother of Emperor Constantine. And the keys to that church was given by the Christian leader, Archbishop Sophronius, to the leader of the Arab army, Omar, and he then gave it to the Arab family who till today, as you and I speak, they hold the key to the church, the Holy Sepulchre. They open church in the morning and they close the church at night, because the church itself has been disputed from the entire period of Christian history between all the various sects of Christianity, the Armenian, the Latin, the Arab churches like the Nestorians, the Copts. And so consequently, the key was given to two Arab families, and they're still alive, the family of Judea and the family of Nusayr. So two Arab families, I've sat and spoken with them. They hold the key in their hand. And you say, if you say there is no historical record, they're the two key, for instance. I'm not going to get into any other thing. So it is, again, the argument doesn't hold water. There is Palestinian. Palestinians are the people who lived in the land of Palestine that was named Palestine by the Romans. And then the people who are Palestinians happen to be, in the first instance, Christian. And they're not Arab, they're Christian, because they're all the Lebanese of Phoenicians, or original Lebanese of Phoenicians. The original Iraqis are Babylonian. So it is the Arabization that took place over a period of 1,000 years through language. I can say, you know, when we talk about the Anglo-speaking world, the largest Anglo-speaking world today happens to be India, where I come from. And I'm speaking the language of Shakespeare, but I am not English. So the people of North Africa, who now are considered Arab, they were originally not Arabs.
Paul, do you want to get in there?
Through language.
No, I appreciate it. I do think I mentioned in the book, I do know that Israeli scholars, other Jewish scholars and commentators do use the word Palestine, Palestinian to describe these people. I'm aware of that. And I've argued that's very much to their detriment, much for the reasons I've given. Now, I appreciate you've given quite a large presentation of the history, some of which I'm aware, some of which not.
Very small part.
I'm trying, yeah, just a small part. You know, it is long and fascinating, I know. But again, I might tend to agree if your argument is that my title might not be so good, but if you're going to, in that context, but again, I'm trying to delimit the definition of Palestinian here as to the supposed nation that was chased off by the Jews, which is simply not true, but is simply at the heart of the conflict going on right now. And, you know, and so the name Palestinian, if you read Leon Uris' book, Exodus, it talks about Palestinians all over the place. It's talking about the native Sabra Jewish people. The word Palestinian before 1960, or before 1948 in particular, only meant a Jewish person in Israel, or a Jew who living under the Ottoman Empire. And so, you know, you can go into all this history. The name, I'm not against the name Palestinian, and yes, technically, by definition, there is such a thing as a Palestinian. Is there such a person who's been chased off from his land and oppressed by Jewish people? And the answer is no. And that's why I don't like that official Israel has, by and large, has adopted this Palestinian narrative. It is to their detriment, and that's what keeps this conflict going. And it might actually mess up a little bit this new deal that Donald Trump has seemed to be able to broker between the Arab states and Israel, because now that so many Arab states, they want to make normalized relations with Israel without being preconditioned on any creation of a Palestinian state. So does Israel want to keep hanging on to this officialdom, this official Palestinian people? I think it's a spanner in the works.
I mean, it is so ironic what you're raising, because I cannot help but make the following observation. Here I am, a Canadian, the first generation, you know, almost half century, as Robert will testify. We have talked about this at great length. But I'm not of the original settlers stock, in the sense, the old Canadians, the European migrants who made Canada. But today, the children of the stock that made Canada are the ones who have now basically gone ahead and decapitated the statue of Johnny MacDonald and agreed that the old stock Canadian committed genocide, and they're ready to give it up, you know, give up their claims to Canada, and, you know, get into all sorts of political reparation and apologetics. And so the question is, when I stand up and say, no, this is nonsense, there was no genocide, and I am told, who the hell are you to say that? You know, I mean, this is now accepted by the government of Canada. I mean, they're talking about truth and reconciliation. They have accepted the United Nations position, UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration of the Right of Indigenous People, et cetera, et cetera. And then if some of us say, you know, well, the First Nation people, they did not even invent the wheel, forget about mathematics, you know, what record do they have? They lived in, you know, teepee tents and so on and so forth. We will be called racist, you know, and we will be dismissed because the major political consensus now in Canada is that we are occupying the land of the First Nation or Indigenous people. And there's the same problem in Australia. There's the same problem in some other place where the Europeans settled. And so your question, I mean, the Israelis, you are saying the Israelis are wrong. It is in the same sense, if I say to the Canadian that you are wrong, they will reply to me, who the hell are you? And the Israelis will just say the same to you. Today in the IDF, Israeli Defense Forces, there are Arabs or Palestinians who are serving, who are swearing oath on the flag of David, so to speak. You know, there are Palestinian Arabs who are in the Knesset, who are holding in some sense the balance of power. Now, none of that is to take away from the substance of your argument, which is about the post-1948 conflict. All I'm pointing out that any argument that there is no such thing as Palestinian doesn't stand to inquiry. And even that too can at best be said is a contested case. It is not that there is no such thing. The Jews were Palestinians after 1917 when the British started giving them the visa to enter Palestine in the period. And then that visa was also stopped. But in the initial case, the visa that was given to them, they were stamped as Palestinians. Well, they were Palestinians. The Christian Arabs were Palestinians. The Muslims were Palestinian. And then after 1948, the Palestinian Jews decided that they would not anymore be identified as Palestinians. They became Israelis, you know. So, I mean, the names evolve, terms evolve, and that's what has happened. What I think the main argument is, I agree with you in the generic sense. The main argument is the land has been contested, and the way the fight has taken place is, again, nothing unique about it. It has happened everywhere. It has happened in Africa. It has happened in South America.
Well, this is what I want to ask you, Salim, is that the provocative title of Paul's book aside, his argument is that the people who now occupy Gaza, the West Bank, and the contested areas are not indigenous to that, and they are not being displaced, and they are not refugees. For example, in his book, he quite rightly, I think, points out that when does a person stop being a refugee? 100 years after a diaspora? 75 years? 3 generations? 2? So could you comment, Salim, on that part of his book which talks about that this is a false narrative, that the people, the Arabs in the West Bank and Gaza, are displaced and under occupation?
Yes, false narrative or true narrative. The narratives are always contested because who writes the narrative? So having said that, it is an accepted fact, I mean, from the point of view of demographers and historians, based upon documentation, since documentations are available, those documentation are available, that is from approximately early 1800 into the 20th century, that is the Ottoman documents, and then from 1917 and after, the documentation that were created and maintained by the British and handed over. It is now not disputed that what land that came to be known as Palestine in the context of World War I was part of the Ottoman Empire. Jerusalem. I mean, when Mark Twain, just as an argument, visited Palestine, visited Jerusalem, he was visiting a province of the Ottoman Empire. And it was not designated as Palestine, it was Lower Syria. And as a province or land of Lower Syria, this area was in constant flux with population that was moving, the nomadic population. The Arabs were nomads. They were moving back and forth seasonally, settling in one place, moving along, etc. There was no urban center population as such. The urban centers that there were, Jerusalem, Haifa, Nazareth, Bethlehem, these were very, very small cities or villages that existed. And they were, in a sense, predominantly Arab Christians. They were Arabs in the sense they were linguistically Arab. You know, and even the Jews, the Jewish presence started growing in the period after 1882. That is the first aliyah that takes place from Eastern Europe, the Pale of Settlement, part of Russia, in 1882. They were small in number, and they came in there and they settled with the visa provided to them by the Ottoman Empire, you know. Very interesting. I mean, I will stop with this. I mean, if you want to go back, I mean, these details are all part of historical record. Theodor Herzl, the father of Israel, the founding father of Israel, he met with the Ottoman ruler, the Caliph, Sultan Abdul Hamid, in 1901. He made many efforts to meet with him, and he finally met with him in 1901. Herzl died in 1904, so just 3 years before his death, he met with him. And his meeting was all planned for requesting the Caliph to give them the license to settle in Palestine, that is around Jerusalem. And again, the details are very fascinating and interesting, but the story quickly is that Sultan Abdul Hamid said no, he has no right to give that part of the land to anybody, that this is held in trust. He is the leader of the Muslim world. He was the Caliph. However, and this is a very interesting point, and this Paul might find it very interesting, he said, instead of settling in Palestine, though there was migration taking place from the Pale of Settlement in Russia, and there was something like, 40 or 50,000 Jews that had settled in Palestine, that came to be Palestine. Not all of them were in Jerusalem. In fact, most of them were outside of Jerusalem. In settlements that they created, kibbutz as they were called and came to be called later on. Sultan Abdul Hamid said, if you're really interested, we will give you the license to go and settle in the land between the two rivers. The two rivers are Tigris and Euphrates, that is Babylonia in a historical sense, or Mesopotamia. Now, just for a thought experiment, just for a pure thought experiment here, as a counterintuitive argument, if Herzl had accepted that and the Sultan Hamid gave him the license, then the Jewish migration would have proceeded and not waited until 1917 or until 1945, after the Holocaust, would have proceeded, and a substantive settlement would have taken place in ancient Babylonia or modern Mesopotamia that would eventually become Iraq. And guess what? They would be sitting on the land blessed with oil and not a desert country, Palestine, because the whole issue about the Jews, and then there are the Jews are not a monolithic people. So the Jews in Palestine historically that had come in during the Arab rule after the Crusaders had been defeated in the 11th, 12th century and driven out. The Jews that had come in are Sephardic Jews. They are not European Jews. Sephardic Jews, Mizrahi Jews, the Jews that were settled in Persia, ancient Persia, Ethiopian Jews, the Habasha Jews, that is the black Jews. So they were already there in small numbers, but they were already there. They're part of Palestine. They're part of the historical record. Coming into the modern time, this whole thing is made so completely contested and complicated, is the issue of the rise of nationalism in this part of the world. Nationalism is a totally new idea. It is, history of nationalism is also very new. I mean, European nationalism emerges in the 17th century, as we have talked about, Treaty of Westphalia, and after that, the French Revolution. So modern nationalism in Europe itself is only about 250, 300 years old. In the third world countries, it is even newer, and in Middle East, nationalism is the product of the 20th century. And as nationalism evolves, the sense of self-identity evolves. So they were Arabs before that, whatever they had been Arabized by the language, because the language of Islam is Arabic, as the language of Christianity at one time was Latin and Greek. In the 19th century and coming into the 20th century, the presence of Jews in this part of the world were Sephardic Jews who had historically connected with the Arab, that is the Semitic people. The problem emerges is with the post-Holocaust migration that takes place, and that history goes back to Herzl. Herzl, in this sense, was an Austrian Jew. He negotiating with the leader of the Muslim world, Sultan Abdul Hamid, and Sultan Abdul Hamid telling him, yeah, okay, I'm going to give you the license. Go and settle in Iraq. That is, the word Iraq was not there, the land of the two rivers, Mesopotamia, and he declined. And this whole argument is wrapped up in the search for a place for the European Jews to go and find a homeland, which, of course, Herzl wrote the classic book, the book that became the basis of eventually establishing Balfour Declaration and eventually the State of Israel in 1948, is the Jewish state. But Herzl, in his book, The Jewish State, never identified the land. He called for the making of a Jewish state to solve a European problem. The European problem was anti-Semitism that had emerged in the middle of the 19th century.
Yeah, about that.
I
said you talk about
yeah, go ahead.
Certainly, I think you talk about ironies. It would be had Theodor Herzl agreed to the land between the two rivers, ancient Babylon. It'd be rather ironic in a very unkind way that the Jews would be returning to the land to which they were taken captive in order to look for freedom. And also, you have to you also at the same time have to appreciate there really isn't any other land that would be suitable for Jewish people than the land that is now. Granted that Herzl and many of the early Zionists that they were socialists and atheists, but still the 5 books of Moses themselves instruct the Jews to go to the land that he would show them. And it's mentioned 180 times exactly, which is important Kabbalistically, because the word life, Chaim, having the Kabbalic number 18, and 10, like the 10th sphere being like the highest existence, so the highest life for the Jewish people. And even if they're not really religious, those who aren't, that will always have a very symbolic power to them. So there really isn't any other land appropriate for a Jewish state except where it is right now. And Herzl, he was an interesting man in many ways, but a bit naive, and he didn't know everything about the traditions of his own people, and I don't think he could appreciate.
But therein lies the problem. But therein lies the problem. I mean, in the case of you are citing the Old Testament, I will cite the Quran. The Quran is the basis, ironically, which you are not possibly aware of, and most Muslims are not aware of. And just as you are writing with the lack of awareness of that history, most Muslims are not aware of that the Quran is the text that basically legitimizes the claim of Jews to have a homeland in Palestine, in Jerusalem. I mean, if any argument is to be made, if you're going to make an argument, as Anwar Sadat made in 1977, when he went to Jerusalem and spoke at the Knesset, the first Arab leader in modern history we're talking about, that is the history in the period after 1948 or 1917, the first Arab leader of the largest Arab state, and therefore the largest Arab Muslim state, which is Egypt, President Sadat spoke at the Knesset. And he embraced the Jewish people, he embraced the Israelis as children of Abraham, and with their rights in Palestine on the basis of the Quran. So it is not simply Old Testament. The Old Testament is being confirmed in the Quran. So the point is not there. The point that you have raised.
I'm not looking at it from a Quranic
Yeah,
view.
exactly. I've written about
I have
this,
to concede.
and Robert is familiar with it because we did a video about this on the basis of my book, The Quran Problem and Islamism, and there it is. And I welcome you to read my book. So it is not something. It is as I exactly pointed out. This is the rise of nationalism, and the rise of nationalism perverts the religious history, because this is a secular argument. And the quicker and the sooner Palestinians and Arabs recognize the right of the Jews to have a state of their own or a presence of their own in the land that the Quran says is the land that was promised to the Jews, the conflict will be over. I have no conflict. I have no dog in the bone. I have no bone in the conflict. And looking at it historically, looking at it as somebody, both in terms of comparative religion and as a person who has studied Judaism, Islam, Christianity, and so on, there is no conflict over here. The conflict is a modern conflict of nationalism with two different people contesting a piece of territory. And everything about that conflict is nothing unique, because that sort of conflict has happened just about everywhere, where two people have contested in the age of nationalism who has the right to establish a state. Nationalism is a modern historical phenomena. We are reverting back to the politics of globalism. What is politics of globalism? It's a politics of empire. So the Ottomans ruled Palestine from the time that the Crusaders were defeated till 1917. And then before the Crusaders had invaded, they ruled Palestine for the century, from the 7th century to the 11th century. This was empire. All sorts of people lived there.
Salim, do you really see the Arabs now waking up to nationalism as a concept, as we have it in the West? Like you say, it's new, but the creation of nations of the Arab states, I think 6 new independent nations were created at the fall of the Ottoman Empire in the First World War. Was that something that the Arab on the street really understood, or were they simply tribes with flags? And it's really not something, because the only real nationalism I've seen in the Middle East is Zionism, quite frankly. And this idea of nations, I think has been created from something from outside, from the metropolitan powers. And perhaps they wanted the Arabs to take it on, but I don't know if the Arab on the street today really appreciates it that way. What do you think?
Yeah, exactly. And if you pursue that line of discussion and argument, then you fall back to the same situation. I mean, the irony is that the Muslim Brotherhood and therefore the Islamists in the Middle East, in the Arab world, they reject the nation state. They are arguing on the basis of the pre-nation state context, that is empires. Caliphate is an empire. The Ottomans were an empire. The British was an empire. The Rome was an empire. So the context that emerged after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire as a result of World War I is the British Empire and the French Empire takes possession of the lands that were ruled by the Ottoman Empire. But they took possession of these lands in the historical period when the age of empires was coming to an end. That is, the European empires was coming to an end. On the other side, if you take the counterintuitive argument, if the Ottoman Empire had not allied itself with the Germans in World War I and remained neutral or supported the British, then anything you and I are talking about at this moment in 2020 would not happen, because the Ottoman Empire would have remained, and they would have then decided how the lands of that people and land that they were ruling for 1,000 years, how they were going to dispatch it, or they will continue to rule it. Look, in our lifetime, in your and my lifetime, Paul, we have seen the collapse of the empire. That was the Russian Empire, which is the Soviet Union. Soviet Union was an empire stretching from, East Berlin all the way to the Pacific Ocean, Vladivostok. 10 time zone, and tens of millions of people of different backgrounds. And now in our lifetime, that is only about 30 years ago when it collapsed in 1992, in the body of the Russian Empire emerged other states, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Belarusia, Armenia, Lithuania, Latvia, all of these emerged as nation states.
Well, that only brings me more to the question, how much of a national identity, I mean, certainly all the symbolism, the emblems of so-called Palestinian nationalism are all Islamic. There's no national item, there's no national relic, there's no national identity. And so that's why I think this idea is nationalism is, as a word, they've sort of put on as a bit of a label without really understanding. I mean, what is a Palestinian nation? Support a nation discerned from other Arabs versus the Jewish nation, which is quite distinct.
You are walking into a modern problem, and that is the contest, because even the even in the case of Jewish nationalism, I mean, you picking up a date, whatever date you pick up, that is in modern time, you pick up a date. So let's say pick up the date in the argument which gives the first instance of legitimacy to the Jewish argument of founding a nation state in Palestine, that is the Balfour Declaration. I'm sitting with books around me. I can read you from the memorandums and cabinet discussions that led to Balfour Declaration of how contested that discussion was. And it was the Jewish members of the British cabinet, not the Christian members of the British. I mean, Arthur Balfour was a Christian. But the leading member in the cabinet, the British cabinet, wartime cabinet, was a man by the name of Edwin Montagu, who was a Jew. He considered himself an English Jew. He was the most vehement opponent of the Balfour Declaration. There were others.
Yes, well, you can.
And so the Jews themselves were divided about this whole issue about whether there should be a Jewish state. So it happened.
Yes, and many still are. Yes, but I mean, Salim, you very often have referred to many documents as contested and other things. At the end of the day, when it all gets sifted, one side is right and one side is wrong. I'm not saying it's a simple question. I'm not saying
it has to be negotiated and settled. It has to be negotiated or settled.
Well, not as to matters, not as to
defeated.
Fact. Not as to matters of fact. As to matters of fact, one side is right and one side is wrong.
No,
I mean,
the fact
complex
that is the religious fact that we are talking about. And as I said, the Quran itself is the greatest piece of document for 300 million Arabs to embrace the Jews. So that is a
you have to tell the Jewish people that. You have to tell the PLO and organizations like that, and Tanzim and Fatah. You have to tell them that, not me. That I'm sold.
Those are facts which can be put on one side of the column, and then the other side of the column are the facts. That the warfare. Terrorism is part of warfare. I'm not defending terrorism. I'm as a person discussing it. Terrorism was not invented by the Palestinians. I mean, if you want to talk about it, it goes all the way back to the Roman Empire when the Jews engaged in terrorism, the Sicaries. And that led to many different conflicts, and eventually the Masada event, and then the total destruction of the Jewish presence in ancient Palestine. So terrorism is part and parcel of a warfare that goes on, you know. So you have had in the period leading up to 1948, the Jews fighting among themselves as terrorists. I mean, the Stern Gang. It was not only simply, you know, fighting against the British, they were fighting against each other. If you walk on the shores of Tel Aviv, along the boulevard, which is on the Mediterranean Sea, you will see the famous monument commemorating the sinking of Altalena. I don't know if you know about Altalena. Altalena was a ship that was bringing in Jewish refugees from Europe. It sailed out of Marseille in France, and it was carrying Jewish refugees, and among the Jewish refugees was a man by the name of Menachem Begin. And on board Altalena, there were, you know, armaments being carried for the organization and the groups with which Menachem Begin was involved. And guess what happened? It was David Ben-Gurion ordered the Haganah, which later on became the IDF, to go and shoot down Altalena, and Altalena sank in the waters just outside of Tel Aviv. And the man who led that attack ended up becoming the prime minister of Israel, Yitzhak Rabin. He was a military officer, or not a military officer, he was a member of the Haganah. He then later on became the chief of staff, general, prime minister, and he was killed by an Israeli terrorist. That is, the guy who killed him was a Jewish activist. So you know, what happened, and those Jews who disagreed with Herzl and disagreed subsequently with the making of Israel, and their children are still alive in New York and in Toronto and in Los Angeles and in Hollywood. They're the one, the J Street, they're the one who read Haaretz, they're the one who elect people in Israel, you know, who are opposed to the other side of the argument, who embrace who you call the terrorist, the Palestinian. It's not you or me sitting outside. So this is a heavily contested issue, and it will have to be settled, and it will be settled eventually. And I can see the settlement proceeding. We haven't got into that discussion. I recently posted my interview in Times of Israel with a Canadian Jew who lives in Israel, Geoffrey Clarefield, that the explanation of the peace agreements that are taking place is the transition of Arab nationalism, which is a sort of a generic term, into a more precise nationalism based upon nation states. And as that happens, you can see the first nation state that recognized Israel was the largest Arab nation state, that is Egypt. Then came Jordan. Jordan was created by the British when they partitioned Palestine. Okay, so that's what the British did. Jordan recognized it, and now there are other countries recognizing it. And if President Trump is reelected, the next country will be Saudi Arabia, Oman, Morocco, Tunisia, and then the non-Arab countries will start recognizing it. And ironically, this is what I pointed out, it'll all come back to what Anwar Sadat was speaking about in 1977. And he spoke about the Abrahamic family. And guess what? President Trump defined the recent peace treaties as Abraham Accords. In other words, what Anwar Sadat explained in 1977 in the Knesset, in the parliament of the Israeli state, the Jewish state, is today being confirmed more than 40 years later by the President of the United States and both the Arabs and the Israelis. So
I
things
wonder,
evolve.
That's
Salim,
my question.
I wonder if I could...
That raises
No, sorry, you go ahead, Paul.
No, I just think that raises a question in my mind. You rightly point out Anwar Sadat reached out in peace. Before that, 1950, you'll remember as well, King Abdullah I of Jordan, he reached out in peace. Both of these men, the few at the time, very few Arab leaders who were sincerely interested in peace with the Jews, they died for that decision.
Correct.
They were assassinated. So my question now, we have other Arab nations and maybe perhaps non-Arab nations who want to normalize relations with Israel. Are other Arab people, have they changed so much that they're ready to accept this? Or are their leaders in threat of reprisals? Are the more militant interpretations of Islam going to strike out and thwart this deal? Is it moribund? I'm not totally convinced. I mean, it'll be a huge paradigm shift is all I can say if indeed this is a sincere change in direction as far as the Arabs are concerned.
Can I just suggest that may be a rhetorical question, because I don't think we're going to be solving all of the problems of the Middle East in this particular conversation. I think if you...
No, we're not solving anything. We're just talking about it.
I think, though, if you wanted to have a discussion based on the title of your book, I think that you've succeeded in making it provocative, Paul. Perhaps we can finish off by just letting people know how they can get hold of your book, because we've barely scratched the cover, so to speak. How can they get hold of your book, Paul?
Well, the book's available both as a paperback and as a Kindle ebook on Amazon. Yeah, there's no such thing as a Palestinian. I'm looking for someone to post a connection on a very useful radio station webpage. Perhaps you know someone who would oblige. But it's available on Amazon.
I will oblige, if not just to have people find out what the particular controversy was we just had here today was all about. We'll post it on Just Right Media's webpage, and of course the links will be in this video as well on the in the description. Salim, thank you very much, and Paul, thank you very much for your book and a lively discussion. Thank you both.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you, Salim.